Hello again, and welcome to the third of our special Proms Litfest events, which you can enjoy without having to leave your own home. I'm Sue McGregor, and I'm a patron of these summer proms, and I've been lucky enough to take part, in fact, in some of the book interviews myself. The Proms at Home events this year are free, but we do hope you can spare something to help raise money for two really excellent charities, the North London Hospice and Toynbee Hall's Youth Mentoring Programme. There'll be more information about this towards the end of the event. Our final book discussion this time involves two sisters, both of them successful writers, Claire and Stephanie Calman, who will be exploring the way similar themes can be looked at differently through a shared background. Claire's latest novel, her fifth that is called Growing Up for Beginners, and Stephanie's latest is called Confessions of a Bad Mother, The Teenage Years. They're talking today to Claire Berliner, writer and editor and programme manager at the London Library. So over to you, Claire.
Hello, and a virtual welcome. I'm Claire Berliner, and I'm delighted to be here with the excellent Calman sisters, Stephanie and Claire. The three of us are going to be chatting for a bit, and then we'll answer questions from you, the audience. So please use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. You can ask whatever you like. And you can do that at any point during the talk, and we will endeavour to answer as many questions as we can towards the end. Claire, Stephanie, your sisters, you have the same upbringing, your parents were both artists, you were surrounded by culture and creativity growing up, so it's not entirely surprising that you're both writers. I imagine you, like the Bronte sisters, creating worlds of your own in the parlour. There were some complicated family dynamics to contend with. Your parents broke up, your father remarried, you had periods where there were relationships, the relationships in the family were strained, and now you have families of your own. So it's also unsurprising that family dynamics play a very big part for both of you in your work. There's plenty to draw on, but you do so very differently. Claire, you write fiction. Growing Up for Beginners is your fifth novel. And Stephanie, Confessions of a Bad Mother, The Teenage Years is your seventh book of non-fiction. So starting with you, Claire, would you say that fiction is the filter by which you explore some of those family dynamics? How much of your own raw material do you include in your work?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. I'd say my novels are not autobiographical, or certainly not intentionally so, but I do think that who you are and your worldview inevitably seeps into every sentence you write, actually. And sometimes you consciously take something from your own life, but I'd say the overriding themes that I return to: loss, fear of loss, trying to be a grown-up, trying to be happy, struggling with your own inner demons, surface whatever you do. And then sometimes you pick out, just to pick one example, my stepfather died when I was 8 very suddenly, and it was really a traumatic event. It was so sudden and so shocking. So something like that, that's a big experience, will seep into who I am and how I write. But also something very small, like on the day of his funeral, there was a big jug of sweet peas on the table, and it was a very hot day, and we had a sort of wake afterwards in the garden, and he'd grown these sweet peas himself from seed. And it was just something, an image that stayed in my head really forever. And years later, in my third novel, I Like It Like That, there was a funeral scene, and I put this jug of sweet peas in, and there was something about this juxtaposition of the sort of lightest, fluttery, prettiest flowers you could think of being at a funeral that to me was very poignant, and sort of made the scene, gave the scene a sort of texture that I think if I just said a jug of flowers, it wouldn't be the same as those very particular details that are personal.
And Stephanie, you definitely write about your own family. It's non-fiction. You write about your children, your husband, your sister, for that matter. How do you navigate that? Do they mind? And would you say that comedy is your filter where Claire's is fiction?
Sorry, comedy's my what? Sorry, did you say?
The filter through which you explore your family dynamics.
Yes, because what I do is I tell the truth as I see it. So I don't know if everybody can see me okay. But so for example, let's think of an example. So what happens is, I think for me, that began actually with some slightly less than pleasant family events when I was young. And I remember now looking back, it sort of makes sense. But we had a stepmother in the 70s, and she and Dad were arguing, which they did a lot. And I remember listening to this for a while. I think I was about 11 or 12, and I listened for a while. And then I thought, I wonder what would happen if I wrote this down. And I had this school exercise book with no homework in it, which was typical for me. So it was kind of blank. And I was lying on my bed, and I thought, I just started writing it as dialogue. And I honestly had never planned, I mean, I was 12, I wasn't planning to be a script writer, screenwriter, or whatever. Anyway, and I found something quite interesting happened. As I wrote it down, it ceased to be distressing quite so much. It started to be quite funny, because other people's arguments are often funny. And you've sat in someone's kitchen, particularly married couples, and they're saying something ridiculous, and you're trying not to laugh, and they're both getting more and more annoyed. And you find yourself saying something like, oh, shall I, make a coffee then? Because somebody's really kind of losing it. But it's sort of funny at a distance. And I think there's a really thin line. So that's really where it started. And obviously anybody who's had children knows that children are inherently quite funny. But I didn't really want to end up with a book of, adorable, amusing things kids say, because that's not that interesting. But what is interesting is you say something very specific and it becomes universal. So that's a phenomenon I've observed over the years. People come up to me and say, that's how I feel, or that happened to me, which maybe it did, but also the worldview that Claire talks about connects everybody together. So I think when I started Bad Mothers Club, a lot of people felt I would like to be able to say, I hate being a mother sometimes. This is going really badly. I hate my kids. It's all horrible. Wish I'd never had sex with my husband. It's all a disaster. And I can say this without being a kind of a hate figure. Don't know about nowadays. Can you say anything without being a hate figure? But then it was a safety valve. And I think comedy is a safety valve.
And do your kids mind? And does your husband mind?
Well, they do read it. Peter reads everything because we edit each other a bit. And we go over stuff. And I sometimes write see me for a joke, because that's what I got at school. Basically C- see me every week. So I do that for a bit of a joke. And he's very good at saying, say more about this. Oh, now you've gone into some generality. Stop doing that. So he's very useful. So he reads everything. The children had to read the teenage book because, as far as I was concerned, it couldn't possibly happen. I didn't want to go behind their backs. I didn't want to run the risk of upsetting them, because once you do that, you can never go back. Once hello, you've got a little visitor. Once you... nobody's anybody with no Zoom class is a Zoom class without somebody popping their head around the door, perhaps to say that the economy's collapsed. But anyway, so we do that for each other. And I said to the children, we can't do this at all if you don't read it and tell me it's roughly okay. And most of it was. To my amazement, they were broadly speaking quite happy with it, and they didn't feel misrepresented. I'm sort of astonished now. But it was warts and all, as usual with me. I mean, Lydia's meltdown in the formal wear department of BHS about refusing to buy a bridesmaid dress is a really memorable moment, because I was trying to spin it so that it would be her choice, like the government does. Why don't you choose that dress? Choose that one. And she just said no and stamped her foot, and it was all horrible. And you have that emptied out, washed out feeling when you come away with the dress, but you feel dreadful and horrible. And a lot of parenting, seems to me, is like that. But then I realised afterwards, is that her beginning to assert her own identity and choosing her clothes? I didn't know it would start at 7. And I think that's really what sparked the book off.
And it's the beginning of the book as well. Mm. It does open it. So do you think, so you filter through different mediums. Can you see yourself stepping into each other's shoes at all? Claire, you're now writing a...
Oh, Claire, about comedy, no question.
but Claire, you're writing a column, so you are writing non-fiction, and Stephanie, you have written fiction because you've written sitcoms, which are fiction. Can you see yourselves crossing over, doing that in book form?
I think I would struggle to I mean, I write this weekly column called The C Word, which is about coronavirus and living in lockdown for the Jewish Chronicle, which I love doing. And in fact, like Stephanie was saying earlier about writing and comedy being a bit of a safety valve, I think I do use that to release the considerable anxiety I feel like everyone else. It's just a way of releasing the valve a little bit. I'm not sure I could do it for a whole book, to be honest. And also,
you could. Can I cut in? She's so good. I've been on at her for
She should be my agent.
No, she really is. She's naturally funny. Her emails are hilarious. There are hilarious bits in the books. I'm always urging her to just do more, you know, let go, because she is really funny, and sometimes quite sort of anarchically so.
And would you, Stephanie, go into fiction?
Oh, well, I can tell you now, I had an agent years ago who said, if you really want to make money, Stephanie, you're just going to have to write a novel. It's the only way. And this was before Dressing for Breakfast, the you know, the TV show, and all of that. And I really did try. I did my best, and I couldn't find my voice, and it was terrible. And he took me out for lunch and said, so like 20,000 words later, you know, it's not really working, is it? And I felt, I mean, I had to rush to the loo. I was in such a state, but I was also relieved because I thought, this doesn't sound like me. So it's interesting. I've taken the same material sometimes. There was a thing that, I can't remember, it was sometime we had a friend who's also now a writer who was at university with Claire, and the three of us used to joke around all the time and make lists and do stupid quizzes and play Would You Rather, you know, you have to sleep with one politician or another, you know, all those kind of games that girls do. And I remember thinking, what happened if I try and make this sound like a novel? And it's weird because just the air goes out of it straight away, every time. But yeah, with telly, you're right. Telly, I had a lot of help from my producer. She was really good. So we used to throw the stuff back and forth and it turned into something. But without the producer, Jane Wellesley, well done, that would not have happened. Could not have happened in a million years. And again, it's the truth. We just told the truth, that's all.
I think there is this sort of strange relationship with truth in fiction.
Oh, yes.
But oddly, you're making things up. You're creating a fiction, a network of lies in order to try to say something true. But it's not really about verisimilitude. It's not, I'm taking the world and putting it on the page. You're trying to draw the threads of it that seem to you to matter to say something that's authentic. And so there's a difference for me between that verisimilitude and authenticity that you're trying. And I think with nonfiction, it's difficult for me because I become over literal, you know, like in my column, I'll sort of think, well, I can't say that because actually that was slightly different. And my husband will read it and say, no, but you know, you're tweaking it. You're not changing fundamentally what happened. You're slightly changing that to give it a narrative shape. That's okay. It doesn't mean you're cheating, you know.
And also with non-fiction, for me, part of what I do naturally, because I think, again, this is a thing a lot of people do inside their heads, is you have this little I did improvisation when I was young. I was trying to be an actor. And what it teaches, not acting, but writing, of course, because you have to think of the next line. I think one of the things that happens with it is non-fiction technically, but it's also, you're sort of speculating. So you'll say things like the day I was trying to get Lawrence back from nursery and there was a play date and we were late and I really lost it with him. I mean, it's another of these moments one feels so ashamed of, you know, and I was yelling at him up the road and this sort of prissy woman appeared and sort of said, oh, patience is a virtue, you know. And I won't tell you what I said to her, but I probably can't say it now. But the point is, you know, in my head, I might say, I'm not sure if I even put it in one of the books, but I sort of have this narrative worked out in my head as like, oh, here come the parenting police, or, you know, this woman is clearly setting out to find people like me, and we're going to be taken away in a van and locked up. I'm making this up now, but you have this, you take something and then you sort of expand it, you know, and I can see, I mean, David Sedaris, everybody does it, you can tell. It starts with something true, and you can sort of veer off a bit. But, you know, broadly speaking, you know, those things that I say have happened to me, I'm thinking, you know, of an example, they are true. It's just that you sort of, not even just embroider. I think something happens in the telling, even when you feel that you're doing reportage, you're slightly enhancing, as you say, your worldview is seeping into it. And, you know, your position, your subjective position is obviously affecting how you tell it. At least the children recognize what I was saying and didn't say, you know, this is all a pile of lies.
You're very accurate about dialogue, though. I mean,
yeah.
We're both completely obsessed with dialogue, and obviously my dialogue's made up, but we're really obsessed about the rhythm of things and furious if, you know, our copy or text gets changed by someone who's changed the rhythm of the sentence, so it suddenly goes da-da-da instead of da-da-da, or whatever it was we were aiming for. And I'm sure thinking, actually, probably most people really don't notice. But it is, there are a number of things about writing that we definitely share, and Stephanie will know immediately what I'm talking about. I won't have to go through a very laborious explanation to say, you know, this got changed and they did this to it and the rhythm's all, you know, gone to pot.
And rhythm, sorry. Rhythm is so essential to comedy. I mean, that's partly what comedy is. You say a sentence in one way and it's not funny, and you say it in a different way and it is. But so and that's definitely, comedy definitely is in your books, Claire. And I think what both of you have in common, one of the things both of you have in common, is the weaving of darkness and light, that you do approach big topics with humour and with a lightness of touch. And I just wondered if that's something that actually did come from your upbringing. Your father was a cartoonist, and that cartoons are almost the quintessential binding of darkness and light. And so I wondered if that came from your childhood, that came from your father, or whether it's just really the bedrock of all art.
That's such an interesting question. I do think it was absolutely true of Dad. I mean, I think for him, doing cartoons was partly, again, what we were saying before about releasing their safety valve. I think it was one of the ways he made it bearable, because he found lots of things about the news, politics, the world, pretty depressing, as do all of us at one point or another. And it's not about using humor as a deflection or a way of pretending that it's not giving you pain. I think what you try to do, whether one's successful at it is another issue, but is to try and, yes, that's that interweaving of darkness and light that makes it bearable, without, it's not that thing of people who compulsively make jokes in sad situations. We've all been in those situations. You're thinking, what are you doing? That's just totally inappropriate. And you know it's someone who can't deal with the difficulty of the emotion. And I think I hope it's not that, but a way of that. Sometimes you do notice something bizarre. I mean, pick a really weird example. When our dad died, and it was, he died of a heart attack, and it was horrible. And on the funeral, which was on a February day, there was snow, and there had been no snow before. It was very cold, the ground was frozen. And we were by the graveside, and as they were drawing to the end of the graveside portion of the service, the mechanical digger, which was really not that far away, was revving its engine. I mean, it was appalling. But at the same moment that I just thought, what is he doing? Will he please stop and go away? Stephanie and I turned to each other and said, Dad would have found this really funny, actually. He just would have thought, that's hilarious. It's like, come on, we're on the clock here. We've got to dig. Dig the ground.
It was both. And I also think, back to the truth thing again, it's interesting you say all this, because I'm looking at Dad's early life, because my next book is a completely different, slightly more serious book about the migration of the Calmans and all that, and him and his parents. And he suffered a horrendous string of traumas in early life, much worse than I ever really realised. And there he was working in adult life, the traumas kept coming, and he was working through it and being funny. Now, for me, the interesting thing that sort of rose up that Peter, again, put in my margin, was something about how he created the quintessential little man, which didn't exist before, as some of our audience members will know, that there was no such thing. And what he had was this authentic response to bad events, and also, I think, which is very topical for now, forces beyond your control. So things are happening in your life that you cannot prevail over. For him, it was Northern Ireland, Thatcher, the Middle East. There were these sort of constant things, nuclear power, the controversy about that, all these things that came up again and again. And so he was trying to think of fresh things to say, but also all the letters we have from before he died, or a lot of them, are people saying, "Dear Mr. Calman, in my Times this morning, again, you've said exactly what I felt." But it's not exactly, because exactly what we all feel isn't very funny most of the time. It's just, oh God, no, interest rates are up, VAT is up, what shall I do, head in hands. So you need to bring something more to the table, as Matt does, who is the most brilliant one, perhaps, at the moment. He does that. So you're laughing, but it's also true. And I think that was a gift that he had. And I think we sort of probably grew up with it. We mustn't forget Mum, because Mum was also really funny, just in a different way. And she was wilder, more anarchic than Dad. She was less cautious about authority. She would stick two fingers up to all sorts of, authorities and organisations, perhaps metaphorically. So I think that fed in. Her mother was iconoclastic, subversive and funny at a time when you just didn't really do that, and women certainly didn't. But her mother would come out with these remarks, kind of, you know, when no one was listening, she'd sort of go, oh, you know, look at this lot. Just little things, and her letters are funny. My grandmother's letters are really quite funny. So it's there. It's, in fact, if anything, the McNeils were in some ways funnier than the Calmans in terms of sort of daily life. Our aunt was funny. So it's all just, you know, it's there. You grow up with it. Like the people who make The Simpsons, they talk about sitting around the table and, you know, making fun of American sitcom land at home, because that's what, you know, that our children are satirists. They've grown up with it. So they can do it. They may not do it for a living, but they are like that. They view the world through that lens.
Which brings me very neatly to my next question, which is about how the theme that runs through both of your new books is parenthood and parent-child relationships, and the kind of overwhelming influence of parents over their children and children over their parents. Claire, in Growing Up for Beginners, it's in every strand of the story. You've got Andrew moving back to the family home at 35. You've got Olivia, who's very fond of her mother, but also deliberately trying to separate herself from her mother. You've got, and she's also trying to find out who her father is at the same time. Eleanor has, the relationship with her father is quite central, and the relationship with her children is interesting as well, because her children are so clear-sighted about Eleanor's relationship with their father. So did you come at the book thinking, okay, I want to write something about parent-child relationships, or is it something that happened organically because they are such an overwhelming influence on our lives?
Yes, it's my very first point actually was I wrote a short story that I then didn't send anywhere, but it was about a middle-aged woman and her aging father. And in the short story, they don't have much of a nexus of communication. They don't really have much of a relationship because he's a very emotionally defended man and there's sort of no way through. But in the novel, their relationship is actually, I think, rather nice and quite close, although he is someone who is not, he's a very erudite, articulate man, but he doesn't really have access to his own emotional life. And that interests me a lot. I do think that, yes, there are little flashbacks to her childhood, and you can see there are moments when his relationship with her changed and got closer. There's a moment where he wonders, he suddenly has a little leap of imagination. He wonders what it feels like to be her. And I think these sometimes quite small moments in our upbringings are quite key. And for her, I think it's obvious that she's a good mother. Her children are quite refreshingly irreverent about their father. And it's clear that her son has a very bad relationship with the dad and is quite angry. And they're questioning, there are moments where you can see it's just nudging her towards thinking that maybe she's got it wrong, that she's telling herself it's fine when it's not, because they're pointing out and they're shining the torch on it and saying, this is not fine, it's not fair.
As the readers can also see, he's pretty unbearable. Stephanie, do you think, so in the Confessions of a Bad Mother series, you're dealing with the pressures of parenting, and part of those pressures, some of those pressures are external, you know, what are other parents doing? But do you think that actually they're also internal, because you know what an influence parents can have over their children, and when you think about your own upbringing, are the pressures also internal? You're thinking, you know, you think every single tiny thing you do is going to affect your children for the rest of their lives, and so it makes it much harder when you have that on your shoulders.
Oh, this is to me, this is everything in a way, because I feel that women, for whatever reason, and even when they're supported by, you know, quite lovely men, as I am, and some of us are, they feel a lot of guilt. You know, I mean, you don't need somebody might say, oh, you know, with, I don't know, with a gender like this, who needs, you know, the Daily Mail. You don't need somebody to sort of come in and tell you you're doing a terrible job, because a lot of us spend a lot of our time thinking we've failed. And you can see, you know, you can just see it everywhere. I mean, even I was in a queue for collecting the children or something years ago next to this really bright woman who'd been I think a marriage guidance counsellor and all sorts of things. And I really liked her and wanted to see more of her. And it was the end of term, and actually as work avoidance, I'd made some biscuits. So I bake a lot when I'm trying to avoid going to my desk. And she looked at the biscuits, and I offered them to we have a friend who's widowed, who was like the only sort of sole dad in the class, who I'm very fond of, and offered him one. He said, oh yeah, thanks. And then I offered her one, and she said, oh no. And I said, what is it? She said, I haven't made any. And that sums up the genders right there for me, be they parents or not. But generally, something happens to you when you become a parent. You might have felt quite normal, and then you start to feel what somebody called original guilt. I mean, never mind being Jewish as well. But this is quite enough. And I remember, for example, I once went into the butcher, I left the children in the car, and there was a queue, and I should have just walked out because the queue, the whole thing took ages. And they went, yeah, we'll go and get your whatever it is you've ordered. And they just disappeared and left me there, and I should have gone. And when I came back, Lawrence was absolutely distraught. He was kneeling up on the back seat, looking out the back window. And I thought, you know, in a few more minutes, he would have decided I wasn't coming. And I never forgave myself for that. And to look at him now, A, he doesn't remember. B, he's fine, and we all make mistakes. And broadly speaking, you know, they've had a nice life. But yeah, it's quite hard to forgive yourself. And also, sometimes I say to myself, okay, all I can hope is I'll try and do, let's say, a better job than our parents. It wasn't that they did a bad job, but they were in turmoil quite a lot of the time. And I had quite a difficult relationship with mum, especially in later life. So sometimes I just think, okay, look, I'll do better on that front. Lydia and I will try and be more friends and not judge each other. But I have to say, it's still up and down at the moment. Yeah, I don't want to, say it's all going swimmingly, hilariously, brilliantly, because it's up and down. And they're about to move out. And a lot of the book for me is about my separation anxiety, which Dad had when he was evacuated. Mum had it because when I was little, I left her every Friday to go and see Dad. It was awful. Though I liked him, it was awful. So for me, it's all infused with terror about loss and abandonment. Ta-da! Hilarious, as Lydia would say. Not many laughs.
Two favourites. But just to go back to what you were saying about, Lawrence is fine, and he is fine, and he is fine. But I think, yes, I do agonise about things and think, oh no, what have I done? But actually, when I think about how many things I remember from my own childhood still, and that I think have cast a bit of a long shadow, and there was nothing traumatic, I didn't grow up in a war zone. I mean, it's really, quite light by a lot of people's standards, but certain things, something small, like, for example, waiting at school, sitting on a chair, swinging my little legs, because each parent thought the other parent was picking me up. And it was just a genuine mistake. And so I was the last child in the school waiting to be picked up. But I think something like that stays with you a very long time, because the fear is, yes, you've been forgotten about. And that runs quite deep for a child, I think. And I would say, if you look even now, at this great age writing novels, that fear of being irrelevant or invisible or overlooked is probably quite a recurring theme in what I write.
But I think that's such a universal theme for me. For me, to be really honest, I find it quite hard to accept that, Lawrence and increasingly Lydia, have someone else in their life who is much more important and interesting and fun than you are, and they pair up with people. And I find all of that quite difficult, because it's a bit like being, you were the best friend and now you're not the best friend, a bit. It's a little bit. And however much I love them and I like having them around, I find that's quite difficult. So what I've been trying to do is just be honest and say, okay, this is happening. Well, I took them to Brixton Station when they were going back to Manchester, the two of them, and they sort of spent the whole journey to the station looking at their phones and laughing. And then they got out of the car and just didn't even say goodbye or thank you. And I just felt absolutely devastated. But at least as an adult, you can sort of ring up a friend and go, oh, this just happened. They'll go, oh, I know. Whereas when you're little, you can't, you just haven't got any perspective about it. You just think, well, that's my life. And I think, I have sort of carried that around. And even now I'm still working on it. I don't find it easy, but I think it's a cliche to say, comedians are all a bit miserable. It's sort of probably not always true, but I think it brings more truth to it. I'm not very interested in jokes that are just about, nothing in particular, or women who say, oh, I'm terrible, I bought jam from Waitrose, you know, and I stuck my own labels over it. And I just think, A, I don't believe you, and B, I don't care. What I want to read is somebody else's pain, or at least truth or doubt. That's what I think interests us in the end and makes us feel slightly better.
And both your books, it's interesting because Stephanie, your book, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that it ends with the children leaving the house and you saying, how am I going to stand here just with him? And Claire, your book begins with the children moving out of the house, and the premise of Eleanor's story is how is she going to stand it there just with him. But in both books, we see the parents learning as much from their children as their children do from them. And in many ways, it's the adults who are doing the growing up, as if the empty nest is kind of the next stage of adulthood. Do you think that growing up is that separation? It's the separation of the parents from the child and the child from the parents.
I think it's so many things. I mean, in my book, the struggle for growing up is also about understanding that happiness won't just be deposited in your lap by a passing fairy. And part of growing up is understanding, not in an intellectual way, but in a kind of core gut way, that if you want to be happy, you may have to do something about it and not be completely passive. You may have to make changes, initiate things, improve relationships, communicate, or whatever it is. So that's what interests me. But I think that's right. When you pass through another stage as an adult, you know, it doesn't stop those things of what's the next thing. Your child moving from nursery to primary school or on to big school, all these things are quite enormous issues as a parent, as an adult.
Stephanie, what do you think?
Oh, sorry, what was the question?
Is growing up.
Growing up. Oh, yes.
What's growing up? What's growing up?
Sorry, they are teaching me. No, that's true. No, what's interesting, and it's a sort of paradox, is my children, of course, are much more emotionally undamaged than me. So, only because I've had therapy for 250 years and married somebody who isn't, you know, dreadful, I've managed to produce these children who are actually quite stable. So now we've entered this zone, which the book touches on towards the end, which is where they are trying to help me adjust to the idea of them moving on, which is quite a big deal. And when Lawrence went to university, I couldn't ring him because I thought, oh, he'll say, oh, yeah, whatever, I'm busy, and you wouldn't talk to me. So in the end, I only survived it by text. We used to text each other about food and recipes, and we sort of connected on that. So for me, the growing up is realizing that though somebody isn't there, you're not there, they remember you. So when I was little, I think I just cut off everything if I couldn't see the other parents, which is too difficult. So I spent my whole life trying to remember, oh, people expect you to show up, they notice. When I was dating Peter, and he got a job at BBC Bristol, and he was 100 miles away to 120 miles away, I decided that, oh, well, that'll be it then, won't it? Because he can't see me physically in the room, so he literally won't know I exist. And I went through this process where he would ring me up and say, where are you? I went to Temple Meads, where were you? And I sort of go, oh, were you? So it was almost as bad as I'm making it sound. So I've had to learn how to do that. And my children have sat down with me the other day and said, we still love you, even though, not just they're going, but sometimes they're irritable because, as my therapist said, they may be thinking about something else, some other problem, not just about it.
I have exactly that same thing of thinking, if I'm not physically in the same room as a person, I find it very hard to understand that somebody might ever think about me if I'm not there.
Yeah.
I've got to a point where I can accept that it's probably true, but at a fundamental level, I don't really quite believe it. It just seems like very unlikely.
Yeah, absolutely.
We do have time for questions, but we don't have questions. So
already.
We'll just put it out there to encourage some questions, and I'll just carry on until I get some through. We've touched on this a little bit. Stephanie, we talked about the pressures of parenting, and specifically the pressures of motherhood, which you were writing about a while ago. And now we've got TV shows like Catastrophe and Motherland, which similarly satirize middle-class attitudes, and they derive laughter from the pressures of parenthood. And there are more and more books coming out which set out to be honest about motherhood, fiction and non-fiction. Many of them are really not funny at all. I prefer the funny ones. You also wrote the brilliant sitcom Dressing for Breakfast, which was about women trying to muddle through life and relationships and deal with difficult parents. And you've got female friendship at the core. You've got women having casual sex. It's essentially a forerunner of Fleabag. And it began its run 3 years after Men Behaving Badly did, at the very height of lad culture. Comedy was and still is overwhelmingly male. So when you wrote that and you wrote the Confessions books, were you simply reflecting on your own experience and the experiences of people you know, or did you feel any sense of responsibility to say what wasn't being said and a responsibility to women to generally amplify their experience?
I think it's more the former than the latter, because I think, you know, with hindsight, it's very, I mean, the headline we most had, we had a lot of publicity for Dressing for Breakfast, but the typical headline was Girls Behaving Badly, which was great because it usually went with a full page picture. So we weren't complaining. And Simon Nye is an old friend. I think he's a genius. So, you know, I didn't have a problem with that. It wasn't written as a response to anything. But I think, as with books, you know, you say something specific. So Jane, the producer, and I would sit down for up to 5 hours and just talk about specifically quite sad and wrong and bad things that had happened, which do become you know, they become human. For example, an outrageous storyline that now might not even seem that strange was one of Jane's, which is Louise, my heroine, is coming up to 30, single, her best friend has a boyfriend, and her mother has a boyfriend. And Jane had this idea that her mother should say, well, I've just about got time to have another baby, darling, but I need an egg. Can I have one of yours? I mean, they didn't put it quite like that, you know, and it's just like that's kind of the last straw. But nowadays you think, well, I don't know, that could happen. You know, you're just sort of throwing stuff out there that comes out of your mind that could come true. But at the time you don't think, oh, I think there's a gap in the market for this. I mean, it doesn't work like that. And it originally was inspired by one of my books. And then we departed quite early on from the book because it clearly wasn't going to work. It was sort of so-called snappy one-liners. And, you know, they don't work when you're trying to do real characters. So the whole thing took, I mean, years of work, be under no illusions, you know, years of work. And that was, I say, with having a fantastic team. And yes, I do sometimes think, oh, Lena Dunham, you know, I did this years ago. But that, you know, there we are. There were people who went before me. Carla Lane was my inspiration, and the Liverbirds. And I was very inspired. Question.
Yeah, we do have questions. We've got one from an anonymous attendee. Do you both think that you write for the same audience as each other?
Ooh,
roughly.
I write for anyone who wants to read it. I remember getting a fantastic letter once from an elderly gentleman saying, I don't suppose you write your books for 80-year-old men living in Cambridge, but I wanted to write and say how much I loved it. And I was just incredibly touched because I thought, I don't really have a picture in my head of like, you know, all my readers have got to be women or they've got to be this age or that age. Because I read all sorts of things and I quite often reread children's books. So you hope to make some sort of connection. The best thing is when someone comes up to you and says, I couldn't turn my light out. I just wanted to read one more page. Or somebody said to me about this book, it's actually weird that, you know, Conrad is so like my father. I felt really uncomfortable reading the sexy bits because I was just thinking, oh, that's my dad in this person's book, you know.
And a question from Beth.
Yeah.
If you were each other's agent, what would you tell each other to write next? I like that question.
Oh, I've been on it, Claire. I've said this already. I've bored her witless with this. I said I thought she ought to write a sort of health Jewish cookery book where you sort of, you know, try and do this culture recipes and then that culture recipes with jokes in between. Anyway, that's my answer to that, definitely.
I'm a very keen cook and baker. Yeah, I'd love to do that. I don't know if anyone's asking for it. I think what Stephanie's, one of the things she's very, very good at, we were touched on earlier about weaving darkness and light, is that, I mean, the covers don't necessarily do it justice because it makes books look a bit frothier than they are, and they're actually quite edgy. And I think for me, that's why they're so successful, because they really go very near the bone and then they're funny. So I think she can write anything, but I know what her next project is, and I think it looks really interesting. But obviously, I'm not impartial.
I think it sounds interesting too. I'm not her sister. Sarah asks, you both draw on your childhood to great effect. If you had both been brought up by parents who parented you in the way that you have parented your children, how different do you think you would now be as adults? And would it have had any effect on your relationship as sisters?
Oh, that's quite complicated. But I've only got one child, so that I'm not dealing with some of the sibling things that I know. One of the things when we were kids, we were obsessed with fairness. Partly because my mother was so anti-sugar. So if a bottle of lemonade or a cake came into the house, it had to be divided with mathematical precision. And eventually my mother realized she'd just say, one divides, the other chooses, and then you're very fair. I think we've got lots of good things, I hope, from our parents. I mean, certainly a lot of encouragement of creativity. And our mother was very relaxed about things like we could make a mess, we could paint, you know, in quite a wild way, or we could dance around the room naked. It was quite bohemian. And sometimes other kids would come over and they would just, what felt completely normal for us, it was clear it was a very different experience for them. They were like, oh, your mum doesn't mind you making a mess. Or, you know, you can dress up, get everything out of the dressing up box and play some mad game. And we clear up afterwards. But I think that was very influential for me, at least.
I think for me, the thing I thought what I can sort of bring to it, and what I don't know, maybe wish I'd had was they were actually, the worst thing is parents who aren't consistent, who change their mind all the time. And they were, in a way, they were consistent in their way. But when I look back over them, because our children are, you know, reasonably, they're not that horrible. They weren't that horrible as teenagers. So I decided to mind the book for my own teenage years. Otherwise, I thought it might just be a bit too nice and happy. My own teenage years were incredibly volatile. So I think what I would have had and what I've brought is probably just you know, less drama. And as I once tactfully said to Vanessa Feltz after she got divorced, staying married. Because I am the queen of tact. So for me, I thought if I can just stay married, you know, just like, don't give yourself too many goals. Never mind what to expect. You should be doing this, you should be doing that. You know, just try and sort of stay in place. As Winnicott said, you know, be there, keep them warm, feed them, try not to die. Good. So I think set the bar low, keep it simple. But I agree with Claire. Nice things we had were, for example, you know, imagination games. So thank God my children just about grew up without screens, and so they played imagination games a lot. And having the boy first, that was a bit of luck. So there were lots of cars and there was lots of Lego and stuff like that to build things with. And I think I see it in Lydia now, working with her hands. I see it now. So yeah, that, you know, we would have had that. We didn't have that. 250 years of therapy and you turn into a writer all the same.
You know, you were like the Broncos, clearly.
More questions.
Alice asks, are you influenced by each other's work? And have either of you thought about the other one's work? Oh, I should have written that.
I do a bit about those columns. If I'm really honest, I'm quite envious. And when she does a really funny one, I mean, I have had columns in the past, which always, you know, disappear in the end. Nobody's there forever. Yeah, I think it's slightly unfair that she can write novels and really pithy columns. That doesn't answer the question, does it? Really? I don't want to write novels, having said that, at all.
I've loved Stephanie's books. I don't think I could write them, but I sometimes read something and I think, yes, that's how I see it. That feels like a very good fit.
Oh, yes.
Something's phrased and I think, oh yeah, that's exactly how I would have tried to say that. And particularly certain things about the kind of rhythm and sound that I think there's a bit of an overlap about how we...
Maybe some of that stuff in Dressing for Breakfast in the TV show, actually. You know, there's a chocolate scene which became so popular that we used to play it when the audience came in. Eventually, every Friday at London Weekend, we played the chocolate scene as they came in and sat down because everybody loved it. And it actually grew out of a chocolate feature that Claire presided over at Best magazine. And there's this moment where, you know, one of them says to the other, they're supposed to be on a diet for a dance marathon or something, and they're secretly eating chocolate. And she says, what's that chemical in chocolate that makes you feel all lovely?
Phenylethylamine.
And the other one suddenly says phenylethylamine, and she sort of goes, what? And it all came out of this chocolate feature that Claire did. And I just thought, well, that's such a sort of girl moment. It's not like the best thing I've ever written or whatever, but I think that was a very me and Claire-ish sort of scene in a way. There was they felt much more gleeful than guilty. That was important to me. I don't want to write women who sit around going, oh, you know, I'm putting away, oh dear, I've broken my diet. It was just an excuse to write that scene, was to push.
That's in my top 3 boring things, is women going on about, oh, they shouldn't have eaten this. And I think
they can't order in a restaurant. Don't start me.
But I always feel like, you know, eat it or don't eat it.
Yeah.
It's not interesting for other people. Just order it or don't order it. Don't not order pudding and then eat your date's pudding. Just have it.
No, that's a whole other book, really. Oh, I think it's written by Susie Orbach.
Oh, yeah.
Another question. Have we got time?
Yes, I think we've got time for 2 more.
Go on.
Which we've already got. If you hadn't become writers, what do you think you would have become? That's a question from Julia.
Oh, an alcoholic. An actor, a really bad actor is what I was going to be.
I used to be an editor. I used to be a non-fiction editor specialising in gardening books. And what I used to be given very sort of technical copy and told to sex it up a bit and make it more readable. And eventually I just became very frustrated and thinking, I'm rewriting, in one case I had to rewrite an entire book and my name is on it in 8-point at the back. And I just thought, enough.
Oh, yeah.
Enough. But I think oddly, I think my parents always thought I was going to be a writer. My dad gave me a secondhand typewriter for my 10th birthday, but it took me an unbelievably long time to realize that, I mean, it's a bit like taking responsibility for your happiness or for growing up, that to be a writer, I would eventually have to sit down with a pen and some paper and do some writing. It wouldn't just magically happen that I'd reach a certain age and become a writer. You know, voila, you have to do it. I now think I couldn't really do anything. I could be an editor, yeah, but nothing else, no.
And finally, Joan Edwards says, firstly, Claire, you're very good at sourdough. And secondly, I'm going to paraphrase, she asks, what's next?
What is that?
She asked what the weird rustling noise. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
What's next?
What's next?
For you both. Yeah.
Oh, for me. So I'm working, I'm already behind on it, but I'm working on my next novel, which is set in the countryside, and it's about a second marriage. So a second wife who feels very overshadowed by the first wife, which obviously, as anyone who loves to read will know, is Rebecca, but this is a sort of a comic, but it's not really like Rebecca at all because it's not a psychological thriller. But what interests me is that step family thing and the new wife's relationship with the kids and how difficult that is. Having been a stepchild myself, not a stepmother, I'm quite interested in it from the other point of view. So yes, a family drama with funny bits, I hope.
And Stephanie, you've alluded to it.
Yeah, I touched on it earlier, and it would be a bit of a long answer, but the short answer is it's the story of how the Israeloviches became the Calmans, with quite a lot of tragedy. I have to say, it's got much darker. You know, it was a jolly story of everyday anti-Semitism and running away from Eastern Europe, and it's turned into something even darker than that, if you can imagine. So subtitle, How Anti-Semitism Saved Us from the Nazis, because everybody had basically left by then. It is quite a dark book, but I have to say, paradoxically, I'm really enjoying it. So I'm doing lots of research and reading letters and reading books about the East End and North London and all of that. So that will be, it doesn't have a title, but it will be the next book.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Another one?
Draws us, I think we have
to...
Well, I'll ask Susie Gregson's question, which is, Claire, will you contribute to the Litfest Cafe next year since you're good at baking?
I would love to. I mean, like Stephanie mentioned earlier about baking as work avoidance.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's true, during lockdown, I have started making sourdough bread and it's fantastic, says she modestly. No, I'm so pleased because it's so much better than my normal bread, but it is quite time consuming. I think what I like about baking is there's a lovely predictability to it. You mix these.
Not to mine.
There's a chemistry. You mix these ingredients, you put them in the oven, it comes out like this, more or less, anyway. And whereas writing, it sometimes just feels like very hard work for very little result. As you write something and then you read it back and you just think, okay, I've written a scene in which nothing happens.
But also, somebody can argue about it. I think that's the problem with anything artistic. Somebody can come along, for example, and say, that's not funny. And there's nothing you can do about it. You can't talk them into it. Quick baking image for you that we could end on if we have to end is something that I think Lydia might have said this, which was parenting isn't something where if you do all the right things, you know, like put in piano lessons, put in maths, your child will come out right. It's not like baking. And I thought, yeah, it's probably more like gardening, or it's a bit like my gardening, which is plants, you know, falling over and wilting. Okay, end of that simile. Thank you very much. Certainly not baking.
But we do have to wrap up. Someone did ask if this would be available afterwards. It will be. It's been recorded. Thank you so much to Claire and to Stephanie. Please do go out and buy their books, because they are just pure joy to read, which I think is what we all need right now. They're available from the lovely West End Lane Books in West Hampstead. Thank you to the Proms at St Jude's for having us, and thank you to all of you for watching. Bye.
Thank you very much indeed, the Calman sisters, Claire and Stephanie, and also Claire Berliner. Just a couple more things to remind you about. If you'd like to support the two charities that you heard about earlier, namely the North London Hospice and Toynbee Hall's Youth Mentoring Programme, you can do this via a link in an email the Proms organisers will send you. The email will also include the link to a fine local independent bookshop, and that's the West End Lane Bookshop. Goodbye to all of you. Enjoy reading your books, and thank you to everybody for taking part.